All right, so we created a directory where we can start creating perhaps a couple of files that we can prototype some of these some of the pages or some of the interfaces that might implement these um, this data model that we're playing around with. So let's start off with maybe the employee, the various use cases that go with the employee. Obviously, they want to be able to log in, register. Perhaps they might have a profile, and from that profile, that perhaps they can navigate to their list of employment. Once they and typically for each one of these entities, right? Usually we should be able to implement some CRUD operation. Right? We should be able to create them. We should be able to read, update, delete them. Right? For every single entity. Same thing for employees. Right? Being able to register. Right? We'd be able to create one of these employees. I should be able to perhaps if I'm not working there anymore and I want my information erased, so I should be able to remove these. I should be able to update my profile. I should be able to retrieve a particular user, giving a user ID, or perhaps by credentials, by username and password. Or if I'm registering, I should be able to find these users by username to make sure that these users are don't already exist. For employment, also, right, we should have some. The use cases might be that I start a new employment, but I then leave. I change my status. I change my salary so I can update my employment. I should be able to maybe list all the employments that have been there. So there'll be certainly several read operations. But in general, there should be for each entity that you think of, there should be at least 4 or 5 operations or use cases that would allow you to manage the life cycle of that entity. Also, the relationships, there should be various operations and use cases that would allow you to manipulate those relationships, right? So the relationships and the entities themselves, right, should be a clue on that should be implementing some use case that was described by the user. Since we think of these as entities that are eventually going to be stored in some database, it's often easier, right, to think about the organization of these use cases in terms of the possible operations that you could possibly do on these employees and employments and positions. You have the CRUD operations, right, between each one of these employments. You also have the CRUD operations on any of relationships between any two entities, right? So hopefully the use cases that the client describes and the ones we jot down and we formalize in a use case analysis are represented in the data model, and they're represented in the actions, the CRUD operations that we might implement for each one of these. So anyway, so let's try to implement some of the use cases for employee. Obviously, they need to log in, register, do profile information. So those are easy ones and trivial ones. Let's do those. Let's do those quickly. Let's see. Let's initialize this as a Git repository, and let's create here a .gitignore. And let's open it up with our favorite IDE. All right, so we have a DR, we have a gitignore, which is empty. Since this is WebStorm creates several files for the IDE, which I want to ignore. So I'm going to add that idea is a directory that is created by the IDE. Certainly those don't need to go into GitHub, so we're going to add that. So we're going to have a server running here. So let's install a server. Let's see, npm init. Let's initialize a Node.js server here. Let's just keep all the standard, the default values. Okay, there we go. We'll need maybe a place to put all our HTML. Typically, in a server, that would go under a public directory. There we go. So we have a public directory. And so let's start creating a couple of things. Typically, when you implement any application, a very common design pattern to implement application is referred to as the model view controller design pattern. It's a very common design pattern out there in a widely number of platforms, frameworks. It's been around for quite a while. It's very mature, very well understood, usually it's a good idea to split up these various three layers so that to make sure that they deal with this very specific concern. Views, they deal with interacting with users. So here I created a directory where we're going to put all our views. Oftentimes it's also a good idea to break it out into either a use case or a feature or an entity or some kind of taxonomy to organize whatever artifact you're building to try and organize it into what its purpose, what its goal is. So perhaps one way to organize this might be that you might have all the use cases for users. You might put it under a user directory. All the use cases for dealing with employment, you might put them under employment. All the use cases for roles, it might put it in a directory for roles, and so on and so forth. Right? So some kind of taxonomy to deal with the complexity. Whatever your team comes up with on how to organize the file system, you should just stick to that directory structure. Teams evolve. They find their best way to organize these artifacts. There are some very well documented ways to organize certain stacks, certain frameworks. But there's some good practices. But it should be tweaked to whatever the team agrees on, right? And ideally, the team just sticks to that naming convention, to that directory structure, so that anybody who's going to be onboarded or it's easy to explain what the structure if everybody follows the same standard. Obviously, the team is open to restructuring or ideas on how to improve the organization, but you shouldn't unilaterally just start to use your own standards. Anyway, so here in user, let's create a couple of HTML files that are going to implement the various use cases, right? So if somebody says that they need to be able to log in, register, modify their profile, they could be all implemented in individual pages, or it could be that one page implements several use cases, right? But you should always be able to map a use case to somewhere in the user interface that implements that use case. Yes, and there shouldn't be anything in your user interface that is not implementing something that's already documented as a use case. So anyway, so let's implement a login. So I'm following also here a naming convention. Login is the goal, right? For presumably there's a use case that goes along with this login, and then maybe perhaps another part of the naming convention might be what is the role of this artifact that I'm building as part of my application, right? So this is presumably meant for human consumption. For somebody's going to be reading this, So there are certain aspects, there are certain concerns for this HTML file that I'm about to create. It's a view, meaning this is going to be consumed by human eyes. It's supposed to be pretty. It's supposed to have good white spaces and good use of layout. So it has its own concerns, right, of how to build this artifact. It is also part of the naming convention might be that where does this artifact live, or where is it running? Is it being generated dynamically by a server? Is it being dynamically generated by a browser? Who is responsible for compiling this and executing this? And finally, HTML, the actual content that is in there. Again, naming conventions will vary from one team to the other. There are some well documented best practices on how to organize these. So let's keep this simple. I'm just going to put here a just login. And there might be several of these there, right? We might have login, we might have register. So view.client.html. Again, well, let's do a very horizontal prototyping, right? No guts on what this might look like. Something that we could put in front of the client. Hey, what do you think of this, right? As they click through it, does the navigation make sense? Mostly for eliciting requirements, right? And trying to identify errors as early as possible. User interface errors are very costly to change later on. So as much as we can nail this down early on, the better. Re-architecting navigation it's fairly expensive. So if we could, that's why we suggest that you do this just on paper, right? Paper is very easy to just redraw, and as this becomes more mature and it has gone through several iterations, as the client accepts these, then you can maybe do wireframes electronically, and then perhaps at this stage, unless you're very good at HTML and you can just very quickly move things around, paper-based are just fine. So here maybe register, and perhaps here a profile. Okay. Right. So just to test the navigation that goes along between these three. These are some of the more trivial ones. You might have here an anchor that just navigates to the profile once you log in. If you go to the profile, oh, did I not name it correctly? Profile. Okay. So this might go in profile.view.client if we click on login, or might go to register if we click on register. So this might be register, and go to register. Let's make sure that we can run this. Let's see if we can just say run this login. There it is. And if we click on login, it goes to profile presumably, right? And on register, if I click on register, it goes to register. And again, you might make this as pretty as you want to make it as close as possible to what the final product might be. Somebody with some really good CSS skills can just dump a theme on this and make it look spectacular in a couple minutes, and then to again as much as we can to elicit requirements from the user. Right? Does this navigation make sense? Okay. So let's maybe copy some of this and put it on the registration page. If they cancel, right? If they cancel. Perhaps they navigate back to the login page. But if they actually register, they navigate to the profile page. Right? Let's make sure. Let's if we go to register, if they do register, they go to profile. If they cancel, they go back to login. Right? Again, we might put this in front of the client that says, yeah, this makes sense. This is obvious. So let's move a little further along in the profile. They might have here some inputs for where they can enter some personal information, maybe their first name in some input field, and maybe last name, email. Last name, maybe email. And they might have a link to update. Href, maybe they can log out and go back to the login page. So log out. Or they can perhaps update their profile, and they just stay maybe in the profile. So yeah, okay, so let's add maybe here a PR. There we go. So we got the profile, and so we got the beginnings of what the use cases for a user might be, right? They add profiles, they modify their personal information, they can log out, log in, and whatnot, register. All right, so then now we can start considering what other use cases are there for once we have identified a particular user, we might decide on looking at what the employments might be. Now notice that the use cases for the employee not necessarily are just the ones we are implementing. This is only from the point of view of an employee, right? If instead you're looking at from the point of view of a system administrator, a system administrator might have many more use cases, right, that are not available to the employee, right? So the administrator might their view might be completely different, right? They might be able to add users, right, remove users, update some of their information. So certainly those would need to be considered as well, right? That's why it's very important to identify the various actors, right, and then determine what are the use cases for that particular actor, right? Now the services and the data schema that is implemented, downstream, right? They might provide all the CRUD operations, regardless of who you are, right? Regardless of who you are, I still want to be able to retrieve a list of users. Whether I expose that to any user, that's different, right? We would have to implement some security that only if you are within this particular role, then you can see a list of all users, right? If you're just an employee, that means that you should not be able to view a list of employees. Make sense? Right? We have to introduce this kind of security measures. But nevertheless, the services downstream and the data model downstream and the APIs that allow you to do that would be there, just not available to everybody. Okay, so from here, it might be that once you're in the profile, you might have access to the employment history, and that might be available right here from available here from the profile page. Perhaps you have a link here that just lets you navigate to the employment. Now that would be perhaps all that information is going to be implemented by a completely different set of entities and relationships and whatnot. So ideally they would be under the employment directory, which we don't have just yet. But let's nevertheless go back up and then down to employee, and presumably there would be here an employee list.view.client.html. Again, here I'm following a naming convention, right? The entity, the the entity that is being manipulated, or the data structure that is being, the data type that is being manipulated, and that this is going to list. It's going to be a list view, which is a very common way to deal with multiple instances of something, and typically there would be a set, at least two separate files, separate views that would allow you to either manipulate them as a collection, right, or manipulate them as an individual, right, like a master-slave view, right, where you could see a summary of a large collection, and then one other view that would allow you to edit or create a brand new one, a details view, right, which we'll see in a minute. All right, so here's our employee list that if I click on that, I can navigate to my employment history, employment history. Right, that if I click on that, I would presumably go to the employment history. Okay. All right. Let's see. This looks pretty ugly. Let's pretty this up a little bit. Let's see. We can do. Let's bring maybe Bootstrap here. No, I need the whole thing. So let's pretty this up a little bit. Just again, the closest you can make it to a finished product for the employee, for the client, the better. Oops. Okay, it looks just a tiny bit better. We might make this maybe put a couple of input fields here. Maybe for the username and for the password. Maybe put some white spaces around it. And give some hints at what it is that we want them to type. Maybe give an example that I want a username there, and that I want a password here. And perhaps some labels here. Well, that looks a little better. And probably these might need to be buttons, right? So let's style them as buttons. And style the other one as well. All right, it's a little better. We might do the same thing for register, same thing for to style the profile again, to make it look as presentable as possible. And Bootstrap and materials and foundation, all these style sheets that are out there, they make it very simple for developers to make things fairly presentable, at least for prototyping purposes, right? Obviously they all look the same, right? If you follow the default styling, but nevertheless, it makes it that much more pleasant for the client. All right, so let's look at the employment history, and let me just bring this with me. the employment history. Let's create the employment history. And the employment history, as the name suggests, the list that we're going to create, right? It's just going to be a list, a summary of all the employments that I've had up to this point. All right, so let's create that. So this will be employment list. And we can maybe put something around this so that we have some white space. So here we have maybe H1 employment history. Let's see if we navigate there. It's still not there. Did I put it in the wrong place? Employee list view. I think I misspelled it. Let's go there again. It's employment. This employment. Let me go back. Refresh. Am I not putting it in the right place? Employment list, view client. Employment list, view client. I cannot resolve employee list. Oh, I totally named it. Employment list. Okay. Okay, there we go. Employment history. So let's style this in such a way that we just have a list, and we could just this could be just a simple list where we can list all the various employments. I've worked at the for town hall. I worked at different various organizations for the state. Right, and they would be all listed here. Right, so you might have here LI, and this would be I worked for the public schools. I worked for the town hall. Right, worked as a clerk, and so they'll all be listed here. Right, and obviously we can style it just to make it look a little more presentable by just painting it with a couple of classes as a list group and just painting these separately as items. Right, just a little more presentable. And presumably these would allow you to navigate to the details page for each one of these, right? So this is a very common pattern, right? You have a summary of a list of things, and when you click on any one of these, it navigates to the details page. Notice that we are deliberately targeting small screens, right? We're targeting mobile screens, and it's becoming more and more prevalent that when we develop something for the web, we first target phones, right? Since they are the fastest growing demographics that usually folks are accessing our website. Although perhaps our particular audience of folks that work for the state, maybe that's not the case, right? That they would not see themselves accessing this type of information from a phone, right? They would particularly want to see this on a desktop. Okay. Nevertheless, trends are changing. Trends seem to suggest that indeed folks are accessing everything on their phone. It's an expected feature of an application. Also, thinking about building it as a mobile application first focuses a lot on what is it that is most important to display here. Right? When you have a large screen and you're targeting a desktop, us developers at least, we tend to, because we have such a big screen, that we have space to add more stuff. Okay, and we get into into this habit that we have to fill the entire screen, right? And that's not necessarily a best approach. Okay. Oftentimes, if it's us who are consuming this data, perhaps we tend to have a larger throughput, perhaps, right? We have a bigger bandwidth of information. We can consume large amounts of information. So large, we would love to have lots of gadgets and widgets and for displaying all sorts of information. But most people, are not like that, right? They might feel overwhelmed if you display way too much information. So ideally, right, you would decide to target or display content that is only relevant for that particular task, all right? And certainly, designing for the phone, designing for the small screen, forces you to think in that sense. What is the most important thing that I want to display here? Is that title weight a little bit too big, maybe? Right? It's the top part of a phone, right? Of a screen of a phone is prime real estate, right? If you have to scroll too much to see something, perhaps folks are not even going to scroll, right? They're not even going to bother scrolling. So being at the top, what can I display that is the most important type of information? So you should think about that, right? And it also forces you to think on how am I going to organize the data and the user experience along that. That make sense? All right. So this presumably this page would allow me to manipulate my employment history as a collection. Right? So as a collection, I should be able to do what? Well, certainly I can view it. Right? I can list all the information here. I should be able to also perhaps initiate a creation of a brand new employment history, or maybe delete one from here, or maybe select one where I can see the details for one, right? So let's add the components that would allow me to manipulate this as a collection, right? So for instance, we might want to have we might want to have at the very top, perhaps a header, right, that tells me what am I looking at, right? So these are my employment history as a title, and maybe I don't need the H1, right? So we have the employment history, maybe some white space to push that down a little bit, but now it's a little it doesn't pop out enough, right? That I can distinguish it from other employment history. So maybe we can paint it as the active. So I can highlight it in such a way that it's distinct, right? It's a headline. And each one of these should allow me to maybe navigate to the details, right? Maybe these could be links that if I click on it, navigate to a details page. Maybe I could have a delete button on the right-hand side that allows me to remove it, or maybe a cog that if I click on it allows me to go and edit that employment information or look at more details about that employment information. Maybe a plus over here that will allow me to initiate the creation of brand new employment information. Okay, so again, start thinking about of treating these in distinct ways, right? You shouldn't try to put everything in one single page, right? What is it that I am dealing with here, right? So let's start off with maybe putting here some links that would allow me to either create a brand new employment. Oops. Maybe a hyperlink that would navigate me to a page that doesn't exist yet. Maybe it's called employment edit.view.client.html. It doesn't exist yet. And I could maybe put the word add there. And it doesn't show. Why doesn't it show? Oh, okay. It's blue on blue. So maybe we can paint it with a different color. Although you should never put style in an HTML document. You should always have a CSS that goes along with it, but that's a separate issue. Oh, there it is. So my add button is there. Perhaps I might want it to show on the right-hand side, so we can send it over to the right-hand side. Right, so okay, so it's on the right-hand side, and you would have something similar also for being able to edit or manipulate or remove each of these individual employments. Okay, so you could do something similar by grabbing this and just reusing it here. So this might be delete. Maybe I don't want the white here. Or maybe edit. There could be an edit button, right, for each one of these, right? That if I click on it, it navigates me to the editor for this, right? All right. Okay, so we have this add, we have the edit, you might want to have maybe remove here or not. Maybe the edit screen allows you to remove it as well. So it's up to you what you might want to be able to do here. If you also want to allow them to remove here, remove or delete, maybe a bar. I printed the wrong one. Where's my bar? Oh, there it is. Oh, okay. So I need to send both of them to the right-hand side. Okay, forget it. I need to add another bar in there. Anyway, okay. So if we click on any one of these, you might want to go to the employment edit page, which doesn't exist yet. Let's take a look at what that might look like. Okay. So let's create maybe the edit page that goes along with this. This would be employment edit HTML. Notice that I'm breaking my own naming convention, but just to keep it simple. Okay. We have here maybe this would be what? Edit employment, and in here you might have information such as start date, end date, starting salary, ending salary, right? Perhaps who your manager was, or maybe a small description of what it was, or maybe some drop down from where you can select an existing employment. Right? So you might have here start date, and here you might have an input field that is a foreign class. It's a type date, so that you can select. It's a widget that's selecting dates, and you might have an end date, and you might have here a starting salary, and of type number. Maybe you have an ending salary number, so that when you click on it, you navigate to. Did I not name it correctly? Did I not name it? I think this was supposed to be edit.view.client. There we go. There we go. And we might need to put some white spaces around this. There we go. And plus any buttons that you might have to update, and any additional navigations that would allow you to go maybe to the positions, right? The positions that you held at this particular institution. Okay. All right. Awesome. That profile looks awful. All right, so we did some horizontal prototyping on that we could perhaps start showing the client The client might say, well, what if we move this here and there? Why don't we change the flow? And so it would be fairly cheap, for us to go back and just move some links around, rearrange a couple of things. Perhaps you would not make so much effort to split it up into so many directories, right? Since again, it might be that any changes from the client might force you to rearrange the taxonomy, rearrange the layout. So early on, right? This is just a prototype, right? And oftentimes these prototypes are throwaway prototypes. They're not meant to be the beginnings of an actual application. Oftentimes we make a lot of shortcuts. We make some assumptions early on, and that we don't want them to continue in the as we progress in the implementation of the application. All right. Okay. So we did some horizontal prototyping. Let's perhaps do some vertical prototyping on how this might be implemented in a particular feature, right? So for that, we're going to need a server. So let's see. How can we do this? So say the client has agreed. They like it. And to say go on and start actually building it. All right. So first of all, we have to decide what stack you're going to be using, right? If you're going to be using PHP, Python, JSP, ASPs, Rails, Mean Stack, or React, or whatever, right? So what's fairly popular today in web applications are all these single-page application standards that are going out. Facebook's React, Sail, Ember, all these single-page application infrastructures are becoming very, very popular. I'm gonna get started just on a very, very little Angular, just to show you just a flavor of it. Certainly, if you're interested, I teach a course just on that, so you can certainly join that at some point. So let's begin by creating. First, we'll need an index page, a landing page. So we'll have the index. There's our index, and we're going to need to load a couple of libraries here. So npm install Angular. All right, so Angular, let's see, where is it? There it is. We'll need a couple things from here. We'll also need npm Angular route. We have a couple libraries. I'm going to copy the library over onto my public directory under a directory called vendor. That's also very common to put all libraries that don't belong to you, that belong to someone else, under a directory so that you don't confuse your libraries from somebody else's libraries. Let's also grab the Angular route. We'll need that too. All right, and let's create first a hello world that goes along with this. Let's load the libraries that we need. Let's name our application. Let's call it the DOR application. And we'll load some of the libraries that we need. Vendor Angular, there it is. And we'll need the other one too. And there'll be Angular route. There we go. And we are going to also have our application. It's going to be implemented in its own little app. If I could type. And we're going to inject all our content right here. It's a single-page application, meaning all content is dynamically rendered. We don't actually navigate from one page to the next. We inject all our content into the browser. So let's create our application right here. We'll create a top-level package or module, just like you would in Java or .NET, right? You break up large applications into smaller packages. Each package having its own pieces of software. Same thing. Most of these newer libraries, they support some mechanism by which you can break up a large application into smaller components. So let's do that. Let's define our very top-level module, and then packages can load other packages. Packages can be broken up into smaller packages, which can load other packages. We can load other packages, right? It's very, very common that in other languages you can declare a hierarchy of packages, right, where each one loads the next. So same thing here. You can specify that my package depends on other packages. In this case, it's going to depend on this other package, which is going to handle everything that has to do with navigation. Also, Angular, like many of these model view controller libraries in general, they implement lots and lots of practices that have matured over the years in many other frameworks, right? In J2EE and in .NET, in Ruby on Rails, on Struts. All these frameworks have matured over several, for quite a while, and they've come up with very good ideas on how to build large applications. All these have matured on the server side, right? These are all server-side technologies, and they weren't as important on the browser-side technologies such as JavaScript, because basically JavaScript was being used for something minor, validating a couple things here, animating a couple things there, but nothing really important, nothing really heavy, nothing really complex. As front-end development has matured over the years, has become much more complex, and so we're now a lot of these libraries are borrowing, right, many of these mature ideas that have been around for quite a while on the server-side technologies. They're borrowing those same ideas and bring them over to the client, such as modules, for instance. Modules is something that has been around in Java and .NET for many years, and now JavaScript is also going to another of the good ideas is that no longer do we want each file to navigate away or have control over where they navigate. Imagine you have if you have just a couple of dozen pages that navigate from one to the other, it's not a big deal to maintain a small. But when you're talking about hundreds of pages, something fairly complex, each page knowing where they navigate to, that introduces a lot of a nightmare if you need to change that at some point or need to maintain it if you want to change the flow. So what these frameworks have come up with the idea is to centralize a lot of that, a lot of the mechanisms of handling navigation. Instead, to centralize one single place where it can be maintained in one single place, perhaps using some nice IDE where you can drag and drop arrows and boxes and whatnot. So Angular and many other front-end libraries are copying this same idea. Let's have a centralized controller where the pages, as the user clicks and drags and generates events as they type, they generate all these events that are handled in a central place so that they can then be divvy it out onto what actually needs to happen. So here we're going to be implementing that right here. This is going to be our centralized controller. That's going to be our traffic cop. What navigates to what? Where we can configure that if the user selects a login, then we should navigate to the login page. And the login page is where? Is under the views directory, under the user directory, under login.view.client.html. And we can implement several of these navigations. So we have login, we have register, and we have profile. Right? Let's see if this actually works. Let's navigate to the index page. Is it index? Is it there? Is that where it is? Index. Index. Let's see. Console. Head body ng view. Okay, there's door, sources. So app.js was loaded. Do we even come in here? Okay, so we are here. Oh, okay, so we need to specify where do we want to go. We can say that the default is that if you don't tell me where, we want to go to the login page. There we go. So we are in the login page, right? By default, or I can specify other register. Why is register? Did I type it right? I'm sorry?
All the template URLs in the login page, right? Copy paste them, not change you.
Oh, I did?
I mean, chat.
No, it does say register.
Well, I mean, you would have done
No, go ahead,
that.
please.
The routing rules.
Oh, the routing rules. Oh, yes, I did copy them. Thank you. That's a very common copy-paste error. Let's fix that. Let's fix that. So this will be register. No, that's login. Let's leave that, login. This is register. And this is profile. All right, there we go. Register, profile. There we go. So okay, so it is navigating between the various places. We'll need to change just a couple of things. Notice that our styles are broken. Login is not working because let's fix that. So here's login. I don't need this anymore. The Bootstrap, instead of putting it here, we're going to move it over to the index page since it will be the only page that ever loads. So it's really under index. It's going to go down to where? It's vendor, distribution, vendor. Oh, oh no, wait a minute. Where's Bootstrap? Bootstrap is under dist, right? Yeah, there we go. Dist. There we go. Okay, there we go. Okay, so we have the login, and if we log in, we go to the register. All right, so all these, right? As we said earlier, right? They deliberately refer to the various pages, but we don't want that. Instead, we want to make use of this great idea of centralizing the navigation control. And instead of each page knowing exactly where they go, right, they instead notify a centralized controller telling them that I want to go, let's see, where am I? In login, I want to go to the profile. Or if I click on register, I'm no longer going to be responsible to know that this is where I should end up in the register page. Instead, right, we're going to notify the centralized controller that our intent is that we want to go to register. This is very, very common lots of different frameworks implement the same idea, right? That the pages that that render are no longer responsible for implementing the actual navigation. All right, so we did it there. Let's see if we can if we fix it. If we click on login, indeed we go to the profile page. Click on register, we go to the register page. Similarly, we would do that for each one of these, the profile page. This would have to navigate if we log out. We want to go to the login. Let's try that. Let's try that. If I go to login and I log out, it goes back to login. Okay, so that works. That works. All right, so that's the beginnings of this. Let's make it just a very simple dive into just one of these features. Let's just do the login, right? Let's just dive into that. All right, so here we have let's go into the login page. And when we click on login, we don't really want to navigate to the login. We really want to be able to check to see if a certain person is who they say they are and validate that person. So we need to somehow have some logic behind this that handles these events. And a very common design pattern that we mentioned earlier, model view controller, right? We would implement the logic that goes behind handling user events in the control layer, okay? And the data layer that would actually do the test to see if this user actually exists in the database would be implemented in the model layer, right? And again, MVC is just one of many strategies to break up large applications into different layers of concern, right? So the view layer is only concerned of looking pretty, right? Of laying out things for human consumption. The control layer is for handling any events that the user generates, and the model layer is for actually manipulating the data. So, all right, so we have the view layer, a little bit of it. Let's focus now on the control layer. Again, whatever framework you end up actually using, these are common concerns that will follow you, right? Regardless of what framework you end up deciding to use. All right, so we're not going to actually navigate to the profile page. Instead, we want to notify some controller to verify that this user is indeed who they say they are. So we're going to bind a click event that's going to be notify the controller saying, hey, they want to log in. Right? So here's a login function that presumably there's some controller is going to handle. All right, so let's implement a controller layer for this particular template. Let's do that. Let's first configure and say that this particular template is going to be handled. This login template is going to be handled by the following controller. The login controller, which doesn't exist just yet, right? Also, if I navigate using the login here, I also want to handle the login controller, that template. All right? Okay. So the login controller doesn't exist. Let's create one. Let's create one alongside the login view right here. Let's create a controller right here. So we'll say login. Again, the naming convention. This is not intended to be consumed by a human. It's a controller. That is its role in the application. It's intended to execute on the view. On the client. Right, and it's JavaScript. Okay. Oh, I created a directory. That's not what I meant. Let's remove that. Okay, let's try it again. New JavaScript. So this is login.controller.client.js. All right, so here we're going to implement the controller. This is Angular. We're gonna grab the module that we are implementing. Is the DOR app, I think we called it, and we're gonna declare a controller on that. Implement. We're gonna call it. I think we called it login controller, right? So login controller, implement it in a function of the same name. There it is, and we can alert to see that indeed we are coming. This is being loaded. So login controller. Let's see. That file, we just declared that file that needs to be loaded as a dependency in the index file. Let's load it here. It's in views, user, login controller. There we go. All right, see if we broke this. We broke it. Injector, blah, blah, blah. DOR app. Isn't that what I called it? DOR. Sorry, that's what I called it. In the app, I did declare it, module DOR app. And in the login controller, I spelled it right? Okay, DOR app. What are you complaining? DOR module, Angular. Login controller is not defined. Yes, I know. I just loaded it. Login controller. App. Okay, we have that. Config. Login controller. Oh, here? Yes, you're right. Thank you. Awesome. Thank you. We can log out and we go to login. Notice that it instantiates, right? And it pops up saying alert login controller. Okay. So we are there, and we would like to be able to click on login and handle that event on the controller. All right. So let's do that. On the HTML, we said that we're going to click on login, so there should be some event handler on the controller. So let's do that. On the login control, let's implement that right here. So we don't really need this. So we are going to declare that on the scope. So scope is a variable, one of those magic variables that all frameworks have them. As part of an infrastructure, whenever you're implemented, whenever you're instantiated, by the time you are instantiated, many other services have been implemented, initialized, and then you can then ask for those services by name. So here, scope, we can declare functions on them. So let's declare maybe a function here that can then do the alert here. So we'll do the alert login controller when we click on login. So let's see if that works. Let's refresh. When we click on login, indeed, we have access to that function. And what I'd like to be able to do is pass in these values, Alice and the password. So to do that, what we could do is bind these variables, these input fields, to variables on the controller so that the controller can see them as well. So to do that, we can name these by a name that will be available on the scope on the controller. So let's give them a name, user model, or ng model, and this would be the password. Right? On the controller can now access those variables and maybe type in and show the value of the username that it's trying to log in. So username, username. So here's Alice login, and there it is. We have Alice. A better implementation would be that even though these variables are available on the controller, to be as much as control the communication between this layer and the next layer, to to make it as functional as possible and pass in the variables as parameters, even though they're actually available on the controller already. Right, so that here we would receive the arguments here, our user name and password, and then just make sure we have that here. Okay, we do have it. All right, so we have the control layer that its only concern is to deal with events, handling events from the user as they click, drag. Their responsibility is not to actually do the work of logging them in, but it's only to interact with the user, right? The layer that would interact with the actual data, right, would live in a separate layer. Okay, typically would be as maybe on the service layer or the data layer, or talk to eventually the model layer that might live on the server. So I don't think we have enough time to go all the way to the data layer, but let's create the service layer that would be responsible for handling some of these use cases, right? So let's create in a separate directory, because it's not a view. It doesn't handle anything that has to do with human interaction. Instead, its responsibility will be to talk to the service layer in the database, right? To generate HTTP requests, receive responses from the server, and modify the data layer, talk to the data layer implemented on the server side. So here we might have all the various services to deal with each one of the entities, right? To deal with the employment entity, with the user entities, with the various relationships between the various entities. So in this case, we might have the user service, and this is client.js. Again, the naming convention, the data type that we're handling, the role of this artifact, and where is this being executed on the client side. Okay, so let's declare here a service. This will be Angular module, and we'll grab the module. It's called DOR app, and then declare this to be a service, and we'll call the service user service, and we'll make it available, implemented in a function of the same name. Oops. Okay, so the service layer is going to implement all the various CRUD operations that would be part of this to modify this entity, right? So if it's a user, what would we like to do with a user? We would like to be able to create a user, right? Implemented in a function locally. We would like to be able to find a user by ID, maybe. Right, from a database query. We would like to be able to maybe find a user by their credentials, implemented in a function of the same name. We would like to be able to maybe update a user. So all the various operations that you think will be needed to manipulate all the various use cases, right? So presumably all the use cases that you captured in the requirements gathering phase, they would be represented here, right? This would be maybe delete user. Okay. If you're an admin, perhaps you need a use case where you want to do find all users, right? Whether you're not allowed or don't have the credentials to be able to do this, that's another issue. Right, some security issue. So anyway, presumably all these functions are implemented here. Let's just copy them and implement them quickly. Let's see, find all. Function, and declare delete user. Function update user. So all these functions would be implemented here. They actually would talk to the server side. to actually modify data. For now, we can just mock some of the data, just give some sample data, implement it locally, and not actually go out to the database. All right, so create user. There we go. All right, so let's our login presumably is going to be using these find user by credentials. Okay, and the implementation will be go to the database. Here's the username and password. The server is going to come back saying yes, this user exists or no, and then let us know whether we should log them in. But for now, we'll just declare it in a local array here of users, of objects hard-coded in here just for test purposes. Each one might have a unique ID, right? 1, 2, 3, and username Alice, and password QQ, and then maybe we have Bob and Charlie. So here might have with different user IDs. This might be Bob. This might be Charlie. Okay, and the find by credentials might be just an iteration over that array, right? Just find me, so return, iterate over the users, find the user whose username equals the username that is passed, and the user.password matches the password parameter, and we need to pass in the username and password. Yes? All right, something very simple. Obviously, this logic would live on the server side, not here on the client. And once we have this service, anybody can use this service that has to manipulate or interact with the user, right? Not only the login page, but the registration page, the profile page, anywhere that I need to access or query something about a user or update a user would be implemented centralized in this one place, right? It's a good practice to implement it in a single place. All right, so we'll need to load that JavaScript. Let's load it from here. So script src. So this is under the service, and this is a user service. So we loaded it, and now that it's been loaded and it's been declared from the controller, right? Here's yet another design pattern that we copied from much more mature infrastructures, being able to inject, right, of implementing the notion of inversion of control, right, of being able to just ask for a service or any object, any singleton, by name, and it will be injected into our constructor. So these are like constructors, and so here we can then implement in this function, instead of doing this alert, we can use this service, user service dot find user by credentials, and pass it the username and the password. Okay. And this would return an instance of the user, and then we can check to see, if user, right, meaning if the user is not null, if something comes back, we might decide to navigate or not navigate, right? So here we might say console. Let's print out. Let's actually print out what comes back. Do a console log user, and so that if I just press login, notice if I don't pass any username and password, it just returns as undefined. But if I type in Alice QQ, it comes back with an actual user, right? And then we have the information, right? So what we'd like to be able to do is to programmatically decide that yes, this is a good user. Let's navigate, and we could do that by using yet another service here, the location service, that allows us to manipulate the URL so that we can navigate programmatically. We can say if there's a user, we want to change the URL as if it would say profile, right? And this is going to cause a navigation from the current page to the profile page, right? So let's try that, and let's try going Bob and QQ. Click on login, and indeed navigates to the profile page. That makes sense? Same thing. Navigate from employment to profile to whatnot. You would also programmatically navigate and pass information in the URL, enough information to be able to identify who's the currently logged in user, what employment are you using, and it's a good practice to encode all the state information of the current where the application current state is, to encode it as part of the URL. Right? That's a very, very common strategy, right? That would allow anyone to grab that URL, just send it to someone as an email, right? And somebody can click on that URL and can see exactly the same content that you would see. Now that's obviously trivial. That's a trivial case if you're working with dynamic applications. If it's static content, obviously the same URL will give you the same content. But consider when you go to Amazon, right, and you copy the URL and send it over to someone, and they click on it and see the same exact thing that you were looking at, right? So that's not a trivial thing to implement, since that page is entirely dynamic, right? It loads its latest reviews. It hits so many databases, grabbing, aggregating data from all sorts of places, and it has to re-render, right, the same information that was originally there, that was being viewed earlier. So it's fairly challenging. Anyway, I think I'm gonna leave it here. Certainly, we'd like to be able to implement other layers, the service layers, the data layer, the data modeling layer, which certainly be a great chance to take a look at some point.